Good evening, everyone. I am Tim Waddell, and I want to welcome everyone online and here in the room in St. John to the first of three town halls hosted by the University of the Virgin Islands and our colleagues at Vitima to discuss the upcoming hazard mitigation and resilience plan, which is replacing the current hazard mitigation plan that was finished in 2019. Anyway, before I get started, I want to acknowledge our colleagues, Cheryl Jackson, Director for Vitima, Greg Winnell, Jeffrey Lima, my colleagues, and the rest of my colleagues from the University of the Virgin Islands. We're excited to be here. I wanted to give Director Jackson a few moments to say good evening and welcome.
Well, thank you, Kim, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming in the church today or online. This has been a tremendous journey together. We thank the University of Virgin Islands for looking at hazards we have, both natural and man-made, to see some new things are coming about. And this is a group effort. This is something that Governor Bryan will approve and will send to FEMA. It'll become our new hazard mitigation foundation document that we use to justify a lot of the changes will go forward in protecting the properties as well as the lives of individuals within the U.S. Virgin Islands. So thank you very much for the opportunity to come to me.
So hopefully those of you online can see our slides. We have them here at the Lutheran Church here in Coos Bay. And I'll go ahead and get started with the opening remarks for tonight's presentation. So the whole idea behind the Hazard Mitigation Resilience Plan is to build resilience in the Virgin Islands. And the plan is something that has to be updated every 5 years. It's FEMA mandated, and that's in order for the territory. And these plans are done in territories and states and large cities around the country, but they're required if the jurisdiction is interested in getting pre or post mitigation funding between major events or disasters. It also, once the content is in the plan, it allows us to provide opportunities for funding from various agencies, because the plan represents both the government as well as the communities that the plan supports. Ultimately, we want to create public support for recovery, resilience, and risk reduction initiatives that are articulated throughout the plan. So when we think about the rationale for hosting or having a plan, we look at our recent history over the last 15 to 20 years, and looking at what happens to our economy, it turns out that it's highly vulnerable to hazards and shocks. And so you have a graph here that illustrates changes, for example, in employment after a major hurricane. And so at the bottom, you see the different types of lines that range from blue and green, and they represent Hugo, Maryland, Irma and Maria, and then Irma and Maria in Puerto Rico, which is the dash line. And one of the things you notice right away is that, the fact is that once an event happens, there is a huge dip. It often impacts our tourism, and it often impacts many of our local businesses. And the question is, how quickly can we recover from these different types of events? And so we've graphed out the impacts on employment over a 30-month period post these major hurricanes of the past. And as you see, the one that dips the lowest and the longest is Irma and Maria here in the Virgin Islands. And that really is indicative of the shocks that we withstood. This was one of the most devastating pair of hurricanes in our recent history. And it also triggered a lot of the emigration of people. As some of you know, we've dropped something like 18–20% of our population in the last 10 years from the 2020 census, looking backwards to 2010. Hold on. Oh. Thank you. Bear with us here.
I don't know what happened.
All right, pardon the technical fix here. Hopefully you can see the entire screen now. Anyway, one of the things that's made this particular hazard mitigation plan different is the term that we added to the title, which is a hazard mitigation and resilience plan. And so on the left, you can see the typical and traditional mitigation planning efforts, and they always include these three elements. First, we want to identify and understand the hazards and risks. And then once we have characterized them, then we move on to develop strategies, mitigation strategies, or other strategies to reduce that risk based on what we learned from the characterization. And then finally, the implementation part of the planning effort is to actually mitigate or manage those risks. And all of those are meant to address the impact of hazards that really cause stress to our society. Resilience planning adds two really important elements. It does have those first three, as I just mentioned. And then what we want to also do is address the underlying conditions of the systems, institutions, or infrastructure. And what that means is really looking at the factors or the agencies or elements of our society, modern society, that actually characterize how our systems and infrastructure and institutions are functioning. And so we want to understand where they're at, how vulnerable are they? And then from there, you can start identifying opportunities and mechanisms to build resilience that strengthens those institutions and systems that then in turn fall back and help us to mitigate the risks and characterizations. So another way of looking at it, and this sort of reflects back to a couple of slides before, when we think about planning, resilience planning, we really want to reduce that disaster impact. That also means reducing the cost and accelerating the recovery. And so we have a state one, the green ball on the left side, that basically, this is where we were in August 2017 before Irma and Maria. Whatever the state that was, the condition of our schools, hospitals, our roads, our infrastructure, then you get hit by a disaster like Irma and Maria. And so suddenly you have a huge impact in cost, but due to the amount of damage caused by the storm. And then over time, how quickly do we recover? Well, in a more resilient system, that downtime and that cost are greatly reduced, and you can actually return to perhaps the same level or state or condition that we saw in state one. If you have a less resilient system, and it doesn't matter why, but if it's less resilient, it will take much longer and cost a great deal more. And there's a chance that things have changed so dramatically that you may not even return to that previous state, and you might enter a new state, what we call state two, which is the blue ball. And so underlying that is that resilience addresses the hazard risk and those underlying conditions that make a community and its system unable or incapable of bouncing back. And so when what we want to create and support, and this is what this plan is trying to do, is promote efficient operations that lead to more resilient systems and a faster recovery in the future. So when we think about what's unique about this plan, we've had 5 important guiding principles that guided how we thought about the hazards, how we thought about the recovery options and mitigation options. And so we looked at, as we've been discussing, resilience, but we also need to look at sustainability. What is our capacity to maintain both the investment and the work that goes into getting us to bounce back? How do we maintain that investment in new buildings, new facilities, et cetera? What do we need to sustain that? We also factored in climate adaptation. This is actually one of the first or one of the early hazard mitigation plans that have included climate change and climate change adaptation, because that has to be part of the sustainability and long-term resilience. We also have to realize where we are, social, cultural issues, what makes our community unique, whether it's our diversity, it's our location, our history, all of that makes for a unique cultural and social profile. And we need to understand that as we think about options for either fixing or addressing needs moving forward. Finally, we have to think about capacity. What is our capacity to rebuild, to maintain, to provide maintenance and support for the work that's being laid out in the plan and its implementation? And so we have to be realistic about our capacity and our capacity to build more to meet the needs and demands of the future. So when we looked at all this together, you know, again, I mentioned those 3 bullets a couple of slides back. We want to focus on the hazards and what that means. We also need to look at the sectors and systems that, again, sustain society as we speak. So we looked at those natural hazards, the earthquakes, tsunamis, storms, droughts, and sea level rise. And those are the 4 bubbles there in the center of the screen. Those are our natural hazards. And so looking through the lens of all of those, we then looked, historically, we looked at the critical infrastructure. How do we get our governance and capabilities, our energy, transportation sector, and communications? How do we get that back up and running? And that's a very important and traditional role for hazard mitigation plans and FEMA response. However, the resilience side asks us to look at the essential services that actually support all that infrastructure, those underlying reasons. And so we in the plan took time to evaluate the economy, arts and culture. We looked at the housing sector, education sector, health sector, agriculture, and several other sectors as well. And so together, looking at the vulnerabilities, looking at the opportunities for mitigation, we then generate a plan that basically hopefully leads us to a more resilient U.S. Virgin Islands. So the plan development, it's fairly complex. It's taken us 4+ years to put this together. And so there's a process piece. If you look at the graph on the right, we've done a series of intense assessments and analyses, both of our sectors and as well as the hazards. We've done the hazard profiles that are listed next, a risk assessment, and a sustainability analysis. We did that with the support from our stakeholders, our steering committee, and talking to experts and others in the various sectors. We've also spent time with our communities and citizens. And together, we have come away with a guidance to help us assess the capabilities, capacities, as well as understanding the concerns. And all of that informs the strategy and framework that's laid out in the plan. And so that's part of the outcome that leads to ultimately the final plan. And so all of that is integrated. And on the left, you see all of the partners, and there's actually many more that aren't included here. But the fact is, we engaged a lot of both subject matter experts as well as consultants, because at least at the university and territory-wide, we can't address all of these by ourselves. And so we got some of the best names and experts on the various topics to help us inform. So together, we see that resilience, it can help us guide our activities, our research, and our understanding. And it's really, this is the lens that we want to use as we think about next steps for implementation and helping the territory become better prepared for storms in the future. So this will be the last slide that I'll present, but the plan goals really has 3 major approaches that talks about managing risk, which is again part of that traditional part. But when we think resilience, we have to think about systems and what systems, how they interact and support each other. And this is particularly important through the sectors that are characterized in the plan. But we also have to look at how to practice governance. And so between those 3 sort of approaches or viewpoints, it'll allow us to really come up with an adaptive management of strategies for risks that are actually evolving, not only because of climate change, but economic circumstances and a variety of other things, disruptions that can come from outside. And so overall, we think that the systems approach and good governance really are going to help us achieve this goal. And so I'm going to now turn it over to Greg Winnell, who will sort of walk you through some of the details of the plan. So thank you.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you, everyone. So yes, so we're gonna now talk about the plan itself. So as Kim mentioned, there were 3 main goals to the plan. The first one is manage risk. Manage risk is what most people do when they do a hazard mitigation and resilience plan or hazard mitigation plan, which is to understand the hazard. So we've done a pretty good job, gathering and summarizing the latest data on all the major hazards that can impact the territory. So what you will see now is, maps like this that are accessible in greater detail in the plan document itself. that sort of show, in this case, the hurricane wind hazard for the territory where, the higher you go, the stronger the wind. So if you feel a category 4 wind speed along the coast, if you are higher, you probably can feel a category 5 type hurricane. And so for each of the hazard, we computed some statistics for different sectors. So in this case, we are looking at commercial buildings and residential assets. So $15 billion at risk is what we counted from, extreme wind. More than 50% of the home on St. John as well as St. Thomas are particularly vulnerable because they will experience stronger wind speed because of the topography. So those type of statistics is, we computed them for, as all the sectors that Kim looked at, the infrastructure, power, water, wastewater, all those, police station, government buildings, homes, schools, all of that stuff. So we cannot show you everything because we would be there until tomorrow afternoon. But you can get all the details by looking at the plan, which I will present at the end of this presentation. Another hazard that we looked in detail, much more detail than FEMA, and FEMA, because of our work, is now recomputing the flood hazard map for the territory. But what we found is that, the flooding hazard is probably undercounted in existing maps, especially on St. Croix, where there is, in this case, a lot of government buildings, including government house, that are in the flood zone. On St. Thomas, the Senate building on St. Croix and on St. Thomas are also in a flood zone. So that creates some issues when we are thinking about, government function after a major disaster, in this case, rain. And if you've seen some of the rain we had, last week, you kind of get a sense for the severity and how, big rain event can put us in a standstill. Even days after, I've seen some fairly big erosion around some buildings in town in St. Thomas. So the long-term impact of flooding cannot be neglected. Earthquake. We spent a lot of time really looking at earthquake. We realized that more than 60% of the homes on St. John and St. Thomas are, at risk when we're talking about earthquake, because they are built on slopes, because they are built on stilts, especially on St. Thomas, and because the earthquake risk is much higher on St. Thomas, St. John than on St. Croix. Our earthquake risk is comparable to, the worst of Puerto Rico. And you've seen some of the news of what happens in Puerto Rico. So, let's hope we don't have that. But right now we know that there is a lot of vulnerability when it comes to earthquake. We did some work translating some document from Puerto Rico that we hope will be adopted here in the territory to help people retrofit some of their homes. Basically, if your home is on stilts, you need to close it. Otherwise, you're in great danger of one of those stilts breaking and your house falling. We also looked at the tsunami and updated some of the tsunami data and did some statistics. Again, a lot of government building and government function being impacted, as well as many major infrastructure. WAPA is on the coast. The desalination plant, the power plant, those are on the coast. The ports, of course, the airport, especially on St. Thomas. So if we have a major tsunami, not only we can have some damage to lives, but also the territory might come to a standstill. We also looked at landslide and wildfires. Those are not as common. They do happen, especially on St. Thomas and St. John. Everywhere you have slopes, basically, you have a risk of landslides. Wildfires, we don't have wildfires. They are not very common, but we did do estimate that, a lot of St. Croix, if it's dry for a very long time, and, there is no sort of mitigation strategy, such as the fire ban that the fire departments, issues, there can be a risk for widespread wildfires on St. Croix especially. And then one thing that we did was go beyond the natural hazard. We also looked at man-made hazards. So we looked at what happens if a plane crashes. So that's the airport and seaport vulnerability. What is the path of those airplanes, and what can be affected. And we find that, again, especially on St. Thomas, there is a lot of assets that can be at risk if a plane crashes when it takes off going eastward. We looked at, what type of critical facilities are along roads, because there are a fair amount of critical facilities along roads, and we all seen how sometimes dangerously some of the trucks are moving or some vehicles are moving. So what happens if we have, say, head-on collision of two trucks? Who can be affected? And we find that, especially on St. Croix, there can be actually a lot of damage. So really thinking about, safety of the transportation, surface transportation, especially when it comes to heavyweight type vehicles. And then we also look at hazardous material. What happens if there's a spill? So we mapped all the gas stations and figured out, okay, what happens if there's a spill? Who's going to be affected? So all of those can be found in the plan again, all those statistics. So here, I'm just sort of giving you a high-level view of the type of analysis that we did. And then, as Kim mentioned, we look at emerging threats. So the big emerging threats, among others, when it comes to climate change is heat, right? So St. Croix was the hardest on record last year. St. Thomas was the 5th, but we believe it was the hardest. It's just a question of, different method of measuring heat. But bottom line, last year was the hardest in the territory. This year is, I'm hot. I was hot the other night. And what was weird was that yesterday it was raining and I was hot. Right? So this concept of, oh, when it rains, it's cool, I'm like, not for me. I was in the middle of Niski and I was hot. And if we are hot now, I can only imagine, I hope it's not going to be like that, but it might be like that, come August, September, October, because that was weird about last year, is it lasted all the way to almost November, December. And everything points to a similar year. Drought is also, thank God it's raining a lot, but what we've seen is that since 2019, despite those spouts of rain, we've been in drought pretty much 80% of the time since 2019, right? So really thinking about a hot, dry future is something we need to sort of think about. And then, sargassum, right? When I was traveling back from, wherever I was, there was big mats of sargassum in the sea. So, hopefully none of them will stop in the territory, but there is a lot of sargassum in the sea right now. And earlier I was in a conversation with, some colleagues, thinking about, what can drive the price of water in the territory. And, we said, well, a drought coupled with heat, where people have to run AC, and the power plant has to decide who do I give power to, coupled with sargassum that can plug the desalination plant. It sounds like crazy, but it might happen, right? And so this sort of confluence of hazard is something that we need to think about when we're thinking about climate change. A lot of things happening at once that we thought were decoupled or were not happening together in the past. And then lastly, sea level rise, that is mostly a big problem for drainage. Right? If you go to St. Croix, you look at the drainage by the seaplane, it's just getting worse and worse, full of water, full of sargassum, full of algae, right? So they have sea level rise in of itself is a problem, but what it does to the system is also a problem. So bottom line, we did a very good job describing all the hazards, and you can get all the details in the plan. But like Kim mentioned, we went beyond, right? We started asking, okay, what does that mean for the overall system? What does it mean for you getting the services you need? What does it mean for you to get power, water, etc.? So that's thinking beyond just the assets. It's thinking about how the service is being delivered. So this is a graph, no need to sort of spend too much time on it, but it sort of shows the various ways that one can get water in the territory. Right, and so we looked at all of this. We put it all together on paper, and then start saying, okay, what happens if? What happens if? What happens if? Like I said, what happens if we have a drought? Plus a heat wave, plus sargassum. What happens to your water? And many things can happen to your water and the way you get water. For example, we will not get as much Dasani water in the store because Dasani is bottled in Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rican, will prioritize Puerto Rico when it comes to, dealing with water. So there are some long-term sort of things that we need to think about when we think about, water beyond just the desalination plants. The other thing that we looked at was spending the time to take a step back and say, who actually is receiving those services? And one thing that, please come in, welcome. No, all right. One thing that we also looked at was who are we talking about when we're talking about communities and people, right? So we spend a lot of time, dissecting the census data, and what we, found, which is no secret, is that since 2000, the number of youth has decreased almost by half. The number of people over 65 has increased, doubled. So the population overall is getting older, fewer young people, much more older people. So when it comes to need for cooling, needs for water, needs for medicine, all of that is completely different when we are talking about populations who are considered disabled. Everybody over 65 is considered disabled by the Department of Human Services. And when we look at the workforce, people who pay for the service, people who work at the power plant, at the water plant, at the public works, what we find is that between 2000 and 2010, that's the blue, most age group decreased except people over 65. But between 2010 and 2020, every single working age group decreased in number, including those over 60, except those over 65. So that means that we have fewer young people, we have fewer people of working age, and more people who are considered vulnerable population. So that has consequences in how we need to think about service delivery, communication of hazard, but also hazard mitigation in general. Another thing, and I'm just going to give you some snippet because this is a 500-page long document. So I'm just giving you some highlight of things that you need to sort of look at as you look at this document, right? So another thing that we did thinking about system, again, linking, flooding and impact on roads to what happens to people's ability to move. What we find is that because of the condition of the roads, overall people are spending on St. John, the aggregate economy overall, people are spending $200,000 a year, more or less, on car maintenance, car repair, et cetera, up to 12 million overall on St. Croix because of the condition of the road, right? And so the consequence, why does it matter? Well, it matters because it's money that me, right, are not spending on mitigation in our home or on other things that can make it stronger because we have to deal with this. So this needs to be, again, taken into account when we think about program, the fact that as a community, we are financially strained because of those extra expenses that we have to do on a regular basis. And transportation is just an example of that. Again, last thing, I'm not going to go over this, but we look in detail at all sectors, all the profiles, who are the receivers of the service. This is on the healthcare profile. We have we looked at, the population. Most of the people are over 65. But we also will looking at who provides the service and how is the service provided. So, one physician per 1,000 people, which is, the lowest in the Caribbean, except for Puerto Rico. Chronic shortage of nurses. This is, again, important to know as we are crafting a strategy. So we kind of anchor our recommendation in reality and not on sort of, oh, it would be nice if we were, because, this is who we are. So this is who we need to sort of address. And then lastly, but very importantly, we also look at land use. So there is, in a few weeks, you're probably going to see a lot of discussion about the land and water use plan because the territory is going through trying to adopt a comprehensive land and water use plan. So you will hear more about some of those issues, but they are very important when we are thinking about hazard and hazard mitigation. So the next few slides are going to walk you through why. So this slide here is showing that between 85 to 2020, the territory has, in terms of population, that's a dashed line, more or less stable, and now 18% drop after the hurricane. In the meantime, the number of construction, the number of building roads has increased while the number of forested area has decreased. So this is an example of what that looks like. where areas in reddish are developed area, areas in green are non-developed, more or less. And so you can see between 85 and 2018 what that means for St. John, right? A lot of more development. St. Croix, same thing, a whole lot more development. And then this is for St. Thomas, a whole lot more development. So why does it matter? Well, it matters because as you probably seen last week, when it rains, a lot of the water goes through the roads. A lot of water goes through, all the paved surface, end up in the road and tries to make it into the drainage, except that sometimes the drainage gets clogged. And so you end up with more flooding. So that's the type of thing we looked at. We looked at the, what happened on St. Thomas or on St. Croix, in 85 compared to 2018, taking into account the amount of development that occurred. And what we see is, and that's the red line, 200% increase or close to 300% on St. Croix because of the development compared to St. Thomas, again, 43% increase. No matter what, more development, if not properly managed, means more flooding. And most of this flooding, and that is table here, happens when there is not a hurricane. Again, like last week, no hurricane, no big waves, nothing really. The sun is, shining, and yet it starts pouring and then it stops, right? So it's not a hurricane, it's just a storm event that creates a lot of damage. So again, when we think about, when do we clear the guts? When do we manage for flooding? It's not just before the hurricane season, right? It's almost year long. Because believe it or not, we're supposed to be in a dry season right now. So one thing that we did based on that, we pushed the analysis further. And we said, okay, what does it mean, in terms of development path? Do we continue as now? Do we try to come up with a feasible option where we, take down the development and increase maybe structure family structures, multi-family structures, or do we sort of, really limit development to a maximum and say, okay, no more, let's try to build where we already built. And so the consequence, and we computed the consequence, and the consequence is that, especially for, St. Croix, there is a difference. There is a difference in tens of billions of dollars in terms of avoided damages, right? So managing how we build is as important as understanding the hazard. It's as important as really thinking about how do we protect ourselves and how do we ensure we get power, water, and stuff like that. So, and that will be the last slide on this sort of, system thinking and looking at the big picture sort of effort that we embarked on, is we looked at social vulnerability, which is, okay, people based on, people who earn a certain amount, people who are employed versus unemployed, people who have a degree versus no degree, people who are over 65 versus young people, people who live in crowded homes versus, non-crowded homes, because, I was living in a studio during Irma and Maria with 2 kids, not too far, right? So really thinking about this type of concepts, and so people who are more vulnerable are people who don't earn a lot of money, who don't have a degree, people who have some sort of disability, live in crowded places. You get the idea, right? And so what we find is that in dark blue is most of the urban area are where most of the most socially vulnerable reside. So that's Tutu, Bovoni, Town on St. Thomas, Christiansted, Frederickstead on St. Croix, and then the whole Carlton wind area downwind of the refinery pretty much. What we also find is that those regions are the ones that have the most flooding in terms of roads that are in the flood zone. So when it pours, and again on St. Thomas, I have an example in Backstreet, where sometimes I drive through Backstreet and it's just full of water, right? Some areas, maybe so St. Thomas, this area, just completely clogged, full of water every time it rains. But I don't reside in that area, I just pass through, but imagine if you live in this area and are confronted with this situation day in, day out, right? And that's what we found is that the most vulnerable population, especially on St. Thomas, live in those conditions where they are living in a flood zone, and the roads are also in a flood zone. And when we compare the data from 2010 to 2020, in terms of population and where people live, we find that, and that's the red triangle going down, the people who left the territory, the 18%, you know, the 20,000 people more or less who left the territory are mostly coming from St. Thomas in town, Tutu, and, you know, in the most socially vulnerable areas of St. Paul. Not everywhere, right? You have the positive green triangle here and there, but overall, we can see that those who have left are left because they were living in the most socially vulnerable area. We don't know why, right? We didn't ask them, but we can presume that this type of situation post-hurricane was probably not a favor, right? To kind of stay, and maybe because of health condition, because of, you know, lack of electricity, et cetera, they said, you know what, maybe I'm better off leaving. So this has a very clear consequence, right? Hazard and non-mitigating hazard and not thinking about different type of population has a clear consequence. People will leave, the territory will lose the workforce, our economy is going to suffer, and we are going to be in a worse position. So that's why the second concept is so important, thinking beyond just fixing water, really thinking about how people get power, how people get water, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this is our, you know, geeky way of summarizing all of that, which is that everything has to work well. Because when a hurricane or whatever, you know, earthquake strikes, if everything doesn't work well, everything is out of balance and people will leave and everybody suffers, right? So this is the second goal, the second major sort of inside goal is to really thinking system when we think about hazard mitigation. The last goal is governance of system. How are the different systems managed? What we find is that, you know, there is some challenges in the territory. A lot of the agencies are, you know, limited capacity, sometimes have low morale. We also find that, you know, people complain that things are not regularly maintained and there's limited coordination and integration. I know that, you know, Director Jackson and Fatima and Director Williams at ODR are working actively to address some of those issues, but those are our findings. And so we have recommendations to assist in this transition. This is a summary of, you know, what I just said is that, you know, the territory has some resilience challenge. And so it's really important to do the hard work of thinking about cooperation. How do we operate as a territory? Are we cooperating? Are we helping each other? Are we leveraging each other's talents? Because there's not a whole lot of us, right? And there's a whole lot of work to be done. And so are we really maximizing what we can to work together to address some of those challenges? So that's the governance piece in a nutshell. And what we find is that it's an item that needs some work in the territory. And so what you will find is after all this work where we sort of catalog all the issues, looking at the hazard, looking at the systems, looking at the governance structure, we have a bunch of recommendations. I will not go over them. We have more than 100 of them. So good luck to Dr. Jackson and his team. You have work for the next 5 years to go one after the other. But, you know, this is an example, right? Strengthen infrastructure, make it more resilient to natural hazard. Earthquake and tsunami needs more attention, especially earthquake, especially on St. Thomas and St. John. If you live in a steep slope and your home is on stilts, you really need to reconsider and start thinking about doing something now. You know, coordination between agencies, education of staff and students, et cetera, et cetera.
Air conditioning piece.
Air conditioning piece is very important. Yes, it's huge based on what we experienced last year, but it's not easy. You know, it's not going to Home Depot, buy 2 air conditioning machines and call it a day, because a school has a bill to pay to water at the end of the day. Some of the infrastructure, electrical infrastructure, sometimes is not adequate, right? We have louvers. So if we place air conditioning machine in this church, for example, we're gonna have to revisit the windows, because otherwise we're gonna, waste a lot of money, because a lot of the cool air is gonna go out. So this work on AC and providing air conditioning to different type of structures, school in particular, is a very difficult thing to do. But it needs to be done. So again, that's the recommendations and thinking system, and going step by step to address all the different issues is something that we try to sort of formulate and explain in the plan. In the plan, you will also find ultimately a list of projects, where they are divided by goal. Goal 1 was, the hazard. Goal 2 was the system. Goal 3 was governance. And for each of those goals, we have recommendations and we rank them. So feel free to peruse through them. I suggest, a nice cup of coffee with your creamer of choice. It's a fun read, but you can go through and send comments and remarks.
I think the other thing is the funding source.
Yes, we also identified funding source. The different type of federal agencies, because this is a hazard mitigation and resilience plan approved by FEMA. So Dr. Jashan and his team will go through this and identify which agency is funding what, and then go after this. So DOE, for example, is funding a lot of work on building retrofits and building envelope. So we can apply to this funding to say fix windows, and then apply to a different funding to get the AC. But everything, so there's different agencies. EPA focuses a lot on air quality. So an argument can be made about living indoors, air condition during hot weather, the air quality decreases. So, providing mitigation funding to deal with the air quality and the AC in the building. So different agencies have different sort of missions, and the plan provides, a guide for which one to look for or act to get different type of funding to get to the ultimate goal of becoming a more resilient community. So like I said, the plan is online for your review. It's divided in different chapters where we sort of explore in depth a lot of what we presented so far. This is the link at the end, resilientvi.org, / the plan. But if you get to resilientvi.org, you should see a link to the plan. You click on it to get to it. This is for you who have smartphone and like to look at things at a smartphone. This is the QR code that will take you there. And that's also my last slide. So thank you so much. Any questions online or yes, Ms. Beck?
Hi, yes, a question for you actually. Since the introduction, and it's if you're selling building from my last hurricanes, what advice would you give to set priorities for ongoing projects during this hurricane season?
For the territory or for the person's house?
I guess the territory.
So can you repeat the question from the beginning?
So if we're still rebuilding from my last hurricanes, what advice would you give to set priorities for ongoing projects to prepare for this current season?
Oh, okay. So how to think, what priorities to think about for the current season? You want to take that one? I mean, I have an answer, but Dr. Jashan?
All right, so we already have a game plan going regardless of hurricane season. We have over 1,500 projects that involve the public assistance hazard mitigation. That's going to continue on. We're not going to go back and forth, but we have to look at the future, and this plan provides us the next step for that. We're not going to get them all done this hurricane season, but we've already talked about working public works with the roads, trying to figure out the drainage system. We've hit flooding quite a bit. So I think, normal things we're going to be doing, Department of Public Works, clearing the guts. We're going to be doing, preparing the businesses, preparing your homes for that. Everything's going to continue on track that we're doing right now. So this hurricane season is no different than any other hurricane season. So continue to prepare your businesses, your families, but we will continue on the road that we have the governor set out for us for ultimately hazard mitigation, public assistance, and then we'll look at additional funding for new projects for us.
Thank you. Any other question?
We have one online, I'm just trying to get the person to type it.
Could I?
What is different about this plan versus all the other plans that was submitted before?
The question is, what is different about this plan compared to previous plan? I think two things come to mind. The first one is the fact that, like I explained, we try to take a sort of system view of the territory and linking different concepts and different actors, different sectors, different stakeholders, to show that ultimately this is one big territory made of parts that are interdependent. Water depends on power, depends on transportation, depends on communication and stuff like that, depends on the type of people that you are serving. So I think we are making a good case for a comprehensive approach to hazard mitigation, because one thing that we found is that, and we see it everywhere, including, where I work, things tend to be siloed. Everybody just focus on their little mission, when in reality, we all need to cooperate. So I think that's one thing. The second thing is really thinking about resilience. And as Director Jackson mentioned, it's not something that happens before the hurricane season. It's something that happens, through time, piece by piece, step by step. It's a mindset that happens throughout, the year, throughout the years. And I think, again, through this plan, we try to communicate some of this. And I think Director Jackson wants to make some additional remarks.
And the other thing that have changed, realize this plan is written for the U.S. Virgin Islands, but additionally, we want to have it presentable to FEMA. That's our federal partner that we go to for the funding. So we've introduced through FEMA the community lifelines. So 8 of those, and we have a whole section in there about the lifelines and how that really synchronizes what we're looking at. Those lifelines are very, very important. Additionally, we brought in the man-made hazards, right? So that was something that was not in the past, but we're realizing the risks are not just natural, they're also man-made. That's also, you'll see that section in there that you saw the discussion about man-made. It always has to be looked at as a concern of what's happening in our environment. So not just natural, man-made, community lifelines, and again, try to get this up to the FEMA leadership so they can see it, as well as for us to internalize. Because when FEMA comes down, they want us to talk about strategy from their perspective, talk about the lifelines, how our plan in U.S. Virgin Islands sinks into the FEMA overall objective, ultimately down to that where that money is spent and how we can spend it wisely.
We have a question online. What
Hi.
steps should we be taking to provide clean water and clean air?
So the question is, what steps can we do to provide clean water and clean air, I guess, to the general population? So
Yeah.
one thing that we are mentioning when it comes to water in the plan, one recommendation is that there would be a some form of group, government-sponsored, preferentially, council, group, advisory committee, board, governor. So the governance system of that group is not, is left to be determined. But the role, the function, the mission is to think about water for people. Because one thing that we found, and that's, the diagram that I showed you, is that there's many ways to get water. But at the same time, if you have one way, it's really difficult to get to another way, right? If people are on cistern, people are on WAPA, people are on wells, very few are on all three. If your cistern is cracked or you have a problem with your pump, you don't really have anybody to call. You have to call friends, call whatever plumber you left on your own device, right? If there's a problem with WAPA, you don't have any water. With the wells, there's the same thing. There's the issue of water quality, right? When it comes to wells and cistern. And again, we don't have any really sort of clear guidance on what to do. So
Mhm.
that's one suggestion that we have in the plan is to create some form of board to start thinking about how, what type of mechanism, funding, structure, groups, whatever, what do we need to do to ensure that Virgin Islanders have access to clean water on a really reliable basis. When it comes to air quality, we don't dive too much into this issue because was not really part of the plan, but we do address the fact in the plan that, some form of regulation of trucks, some form of regulation of emission needs to happen. But we don't go too much into detail because this is not a sort of climate plan. I think the Energy Office is working on such a plan right now. And then when it comes to air quality, one of the major driver recently related to hazard of bad air quality is the landfill. And so we do mention, the fact that the territory has a debris management plan. We do mention the benefits of composting versus burning when it comes to dealing with vegetation debris and all type of debris that can be composted. We do talk about the need for cooperation and coordination between agencies because, Department of Agriculture can benefit from some of this composted material that, cannot, or, we don't have to stockpile and use some land and ship it or burn it or anything like that, that will take a lot of resources away from other type of work. So we do talk about, consequence of fires from that point of view, which comes down to better coordination and better management of resources.
Dr. Ganell? Dr. Ganell?
Another question?
Yeah,
Yes. Dr. Ganell, may I speak?
sorry, Mr. Harris, if you don't mind typing your question or comment in the chat, because we're not going to be able to hear you otherwise. So please type it into the chat so I can go ahead and repeat it for Greg to answer or for Director Johnson. Thank you.
Okay. No, it was a comment I was going to make, so it's okay. Thank you, though. Appreciate it.
Aging population.
Yeah, maybe you do want to then translate and share that it's a very thorough, detailed presentation.
Judy has a question after that.
What YTEMA has done under the current,
All right, so this is sponsored and managed, maintained through the Department of Human Services, Commissioner Everett George, Commissioner Designee George. So there's over 1,000 individuals already registered on this registry. It's all voluntary. And this is, you can sign up through Department of Human Services, you can go to the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, go to the election offices. Anybody over age 60 or 60 and over living alone, first of all. Second, if you have any disability, you live alone, you can also sign up for this. Lets us know through YTEMA, to 911, lets us know through fire, EMS, police, and we want to check on individuals following an event and following a storm. And now part of this is maintaining that list with the Department of Human Services. We make sure that list is managed and maintained. And again, it's voluntary. We want to make sure it's updated also for each hurricane season or event that can come up. So we would want to go out and make sure this goes back to Senator DeGraff, great senator, as far as putting this forward, learning lessons from Irma Maria, make sure we have that going forward. We're trying to get more individuals on top of that as far as signed up. We want to go out, so reach out for health and welfare following a storm event to go by with our volunteers. In addition to that, with EMS and fire, knock on your door, make sure you're okay. Excellent question to ask. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Judy.
Yeah, I have a question, to Director Johnson. With regard, it's a similar question to what you were asked this morning. Has to do with telecommunications involving the different carriers in the territory and, what steps are being taken, which is part of the plan to make sure that anybody who needs to communicate with emergency responders can do so reliably in case of a natural disaster.
All right, so if there's a question, first of all, how we communicate amongst ourselves as first responders, we have a trunking network that's managed and maintained by the Bureau of Information Technology, which we go from 911, which you have in St. Thomas and St. Croix, for fire, EMS, or dispatch, as well as calling in to 911. Now, most cases, if you're in a territory, you punch 911, you will get 911 in St. Croix or for overload at St. Thomas and vice versa. The island of St. John, down in Coral Bay, you have the longer number to call to get in. Sometimes you end up going over to Tortola, the BBI. They will transfer you one button transfer to the St. Thomas 911 dispatch. So that's the first one. Second one is you as an individual have a personal phone. You can also sign up for messaging. As long as those messages are turned on in your phone system to receive those. Those are operator. You as a user have to access that and put it in there. And so you can sign up for the Alert BI messaging by Vitima. You know, the Vitima website at www.vitima.bi.gov, and you can sign up and you can get these messages in English or Spanish. You choose which way you want to get it. You choose whether you want to get it by phone or by text or email. Those will come to you. Now the carriers, we have those 3 or 4 carriers here that we partner with to make sure they're tested. And we test them every, third of every month. We test our tsunami sirens. And before that Wednesday, we put out a text notice or alert message that says we're going to be testing our system. So if you don't receive that message, something is not right with your system. We also look at our phone from the carriers that we test, find out why those systems aren't activated. We don't know 100% why they're not, but we get enough individuals concerned about that, and feedback is important to us. That we get hold of the carriers and have those discussions. And we know the Liberty migration from Liberty, the AT&T, that's taken some challenges to do that, and there's still some updates that are going on. So this morning we talked about some indications or maybe some differences with the carriers and their ability to get the alert messages going out. That's through the Alert BI system. So please make sure you have that set up. If you don't get that message and it goes out, please let us know. By team, you can call any one of our offices. You can call St. John at 776-2244. You can call St. Croix at 773-2244 or St. Thomas at 774-2244. Let us know. That feedback's important, just like we had the flooding over on St. Croix. That feedback is great to see. That the videos are important for us to be aware where that drainage is having problems. We can get out with Public Works and fix that drainage. So, man, did it help answer your question?
Well, it does in part, but what I'm wondering is emergency and telecommunications part of the HMRP plan?
Yes.
Is there a component in the plan that is?
Yes.
Yep, great.
Yes. Yes, the answer is yes. We did it looking at cell phone communication, internet communication as well, because ultimately everything, including cell phone, goes through the internet. One of the major issues that we faced is the fact that all the providers for cell phone and fixed phone are private, and they do not share data. They do not give us any information on, how their system is doing and what are the major vulnerabilities. So we did our best to assess those vulnerabilities. We found that there are some fiber access points, which are physical structure where telecommunication goes from the air or from a network into a different type of internet network. A lot of them are vulnerable to flooding and other type of hazard, but we could not quantify more than that because, again, we don't have the data. One thing that is of interest, maybe, and address some of your questions, is the fact that we found that St. John is the least covered island of all the 3 islands. And we did that by just, driving around and collecting cell phone quality reception data set. So we found that there is a lot of dead zone on St. John in particular. And after the plan, we started a different project that is still ongoing, where we compare the 3 providers. We compare Liberty, Via, and T-Mobile. And we are still in the process of collecting data. We covered all the major islands more or less, but we still have some areas. But again, we also find that St. John has a lot of issues when it comes to reception from the cell phone providers. But we'll put this aside, so some of the data is published into the plan. And we are hoping at early fall, we're gonna publish new maps comparing the performance of the three providers in the territory. Oh, sorry, Dr. Jackson. There's nothing that the government can do because those are private companies. But hopefully through, lobbying from the government and lobbying from you, you can then talk to some of those support providers and sort of figure out what can be done.
All right, so I'm gonna talk about something called FirstNet. This is not probably in your plan at all, but this is something that's going on nationwide and it's being sponsored by AT&T. They're spending over $1 trillion to put this first responder network in. And the benefit fine if AT&T is not here, but yet AT&T has the contract to basically put that backbone in for us. And we've added at least 6 to 8 additional tower sites on St. Thomas and St. Croix, and at least 3 or 4 going into St. John also. That will give us increased coverage. Now, the AT&T phone you have is sold by Liberty, and it has what's called band 14 on it, which gives you the ability to be on that. And depending upon whether you're a first responder or a second responder, or you're a normal citizen that wants to have good reliability, you can subscribe for additional fee for this FirstNet service. So that's something, again, outside of the hazard mitigation plan, but this has been going on for at least 10 years in the territory. We're probably about 85% built out. BIT with Director Ross is the main coordinator for that for the governor. We do meet with FirstNet. My Assistant Director Steve Blasio, I met with FirstNet about a couple weeks ago to talk about the build out and where it's going. We'll still have one area on the western side of St. Thomas we're looking at and the solution for that, and then on St. Croix, the very east end for the final coverage for that. And that's a great topic to bring up, and FirstNet is really the next step for us to get that coverage besides the private sector, the ones just local, band 14.
Yes.
Okay, we have another comment from our listening audience. Mr. Harris would like to thank you for a comprehensive presentation. It was very well thought through. And Director Johnson, he wants to thank you for having an open mind to provide clean air and inviting him to his meeting this morning.
Okay, well, if there's no more question, thank you, everyone. Please review the plan and send comments either via email or in the plan at the beginning. There is a page where you can do that. Tim? You have 1 month starting now. No, joking aside, 40 days, 30 days, effective today. So we're gonna continue this meeting series next week on St. John, on St. Croix and St. Thomas. But today is the beginning when the clock starts. And so 30 days from today is when the comments are due. Whether you are, wherever you are in the Virgin Islands.